We are in week 4 of this series that we've been doing called The Prophets. Now, the prophets are Old Testament books where God spoke through people to guide his people back when they were getting off track. The prophets are at the end of the Old Testament, the first half of the Bible. And here's a helpful brief look at how the Old Testament is structured and where the prophets land in it. I want to show you a little bit about what this looks like. Now you'll see this here behind me. The first section of the Old Testament, we have the law, which is Genesis, the beginning, through Deuteronomy. It covers creation, Exodus, the law of Moses. Exodus is God leading God's people out of slavery in Egypt. God establishes what God's new covenant looks like with his people. God lays out these laws and systems and ways of living to help people thrive. And then you enter this section of history, which is Joshua through Esther. These books that are sandwiched in here, these are the story of Israel from conquest to exile. Jared talked a lot last week in week 1 of Jeremiah. We're going to be in week 2 of Jeremiah today. Jared talked a lot last week about how exile was this period of time where God led, because of Israel's sin and the natural consequences of them not following God's laws. A conquering empire took over them, Babylon, and this is the story of that exile. That's what exile is. And then you enter this period of poetry, wisdom, this collection of writings, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, etc. The reflections, prayer, philosophy, wisdom. They're the questions to the great questions we have in life, and the writers wrestling through that and talking about how God interacts with us. And then you have this section, prophets, which is Isaiah through Malachi. And the prophets, as I said earlier, they're messages from God, but they occur during the history period. So this is why I wanted to show you this, because some of us might think the Bible is laid out chronologically. And to some extent, parts of it are, but what we're going to do today is we're going to jump into Jeremiah the prophet, his words, his messages from God to the people of Israel during the events that happened during the history period. So I want to actually start out this morning by going back to one of the books that occurs in history, because we want to read about the actual historical events that happened during these words of Jeremiah that we read about later in the prophets section. So we're going to be in 2 Chronicles 36, which is the historical account of the events that happened to Israel during Jeremiah's prophetic ministry. So we're going to be in 2 Chronicles 36, 15 through 21, and it's going to be a little bit of a lengthy section, but I want to encourage you, stay with me, because this is really important. It kind of lays the foundation of where we're headed, okay? All right, here we go. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them as Israel, through his messengers, these prophets, again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, and did not spare young men or young women, the elderly or the infirm. God gave them all into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Now you know how to say that name. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. What this is saying is they gathered up all this very important things, the core of what was identifying to Israel, their most special possessions in the temple, where it was thought this is where God's presence actually lives. Babylon wiped it all out. They took all of it. They decimated it. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, the capital, the hub of Israel, of Judah. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant, the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him, Nebuchadnezzar, and his successors until the king of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. So in this section that we read, God is sending all these prophets, these messengers, to proclaim to the people of Israel over and over again to come back to following God's ways, to try to right their path, to call out what Jared talked about last week, injustice, idolatry, and Jeremiah is giving this prophetic commentary on what would happen to Israel's future should they choose not to listen, what the natural cascade of events would be, which was exile. Well, in this case, they were sent into exile. We learned that last week. Jared explained last week how Babylon came in and conquered. They rounded up in waves of people over a couple of decades. They rounded up in waves of people of Judah, and they sent them to live in the land and under the authority of the Babylonian Empire. Now, I want to hone in on this very last verse here. This very last verse talks about rest. It's an odd word that occurs at the end of this historical account. It's an odd word that occurs because it doesn't really fit thematically with everything else that's being talked about here. What does this reference of rest really mean, and why does it occur here in this seemingly very not restful, chaotic war scene? What is God trying to communicate and re-emphasizing with this word rest? Well, the theme of rest is one that actually begins at the very beginning of the Bible. In the very beginning of creation, the Genesis story, God modeled resting. On the seventh day of creation, God rested. Rest was commanded by God weekly, and we call it Sabbath. Now, I know one great way I love to rest is taking a nap. Who are you can nap in 15, 20 minutes in the middle of the day, and you just wake up energized and you're good to go? I love that for you. Who are my 3-hour nappers? That's me. And you might wake up what year is it? And then you kind of slowly recover, and then I actually can just jump straight back into my day. I don't have any problem with that. I know my 15 to 20-minute nappers are horrified at that because you cannot recover from a 3-hour nap. Your day is done. Well, rest, biblical rest, I'm not gonna downplay napping. I love a good nap. That is rest, and I think God can totally use that. But biblical rest is actually so much more than just a good nap. Biblical rest is more than stopping. It's actually this action of delighting. Biblical rest, this idea of Sabbath, it's not just about what you don't do, it's about what you make space for. It's about the things that bring you joy. It's about inviting beauty and presence and this posture of worship into our lives. Biblical rest is this act of trust that I'm not what I produce and do. That's not my identity. It's who I'm being in the presence of God, this action of resting. It's what God sees and values in me, not just what I produce and do to impress others, to fulfill some sort of expectation of what I think God has on me and how my life should look. Biblical rest is also this act of resistance in this culture that glorifies hustle and burnout. Sabbath actually pushes back against that. It's this protest against these Pharaoh-like systems, and for the people of Israel, that would be reminiscent of their time in Egypt, where they spent a long, long time unable to rest because of their slavery to Pharaoh. God led them in freedom out of that into a new way of life. And so biblical rest is this pushing back against these Pharaoh-like systems of our culture that demand endless burnout and endless output. Rest is also how we remember who we are. We rest to return to our identity as God's beloved, not slaves to busyness or money or image. And rest, lastly, it's actually built into creation, what God intended for us, for creation to experience. God rested not because God was tired. God didn't finish like 6 days of creation, was like, whoa, I need a nap after that. That's not why God rested. God rested to show us this rhythm that we were made for. Work from rest, not toward it. I've had to really wrestle through that and work through that. Work from rest, not toward it. So in addition to a rhythm of weekly rest that God had asked of God's people of Israel, God also told Israel to let their land rest every 7 years. No planting, no harvesting. This wasn't just farming advice, though. It wasn't this agricultural advice. It was a test of trust. God was saying, stop working and watch me work for you. Watch me provide. But Israel found this hard. They found it difficult to listen to God. They kept working, thinking, well, God will understand. And they did that every 7 years, after every 7 years, after every 7 years. For hundreds of years, they skipped this ask from God to rest, of both Sabbath, weekly rest, and this 7th year of agricultural rest. For centuries, they skipped it, even though God kept calling them back to practice this idea of rest. But God's people didn't listen. They trusted their own hard work. They valued things like wealth and stability, financial entrepreneurship. Eventually, after all this time, they felt God to be irrelevant, because why would God be relevant anymore? If I can provide for myself, if I can find stability and wealth and security on my own without God, why would I need God? They believed they could provide for themselves without God. And so they bought the lie that they could be their own God, not Yahweh, the one true God of their ancestors. And so eventually, it's no surprise, like we learned last week, they turned to an idol called Baal. Baal was an idol god who represented agricultural power, the very thing they valued and prized above rest. Baal represented wealth, stability, financial success, the very things Israel had replaced with simply resting in God's presence. Sound familiar? Well, we don't worship Baal. If you do, please talk to me after. That would be a fascinating conversation. I'd love to hear about that. While we don't worship Baal, we actually worship the very things that Baal represents. In our culture, we worship things like busyness, and we see rest as a sign of weakness. Eventually, God allowed Israel to experience this forced rest, this period of exile, this 70 years in exile, where the values of the Babylonian people were what they had already allowed to define them in place of God's identity. And so it was the Babylonian Empire that eventually defeated them. You see, when we refuse to rest, sometimes rest comes in forced ways. And it sometimes comes in the form of burnout, in the form of breakdown or crisis. This is the very story of Israel, and it's the very story that we wrestle with today. Jeremiah is calling out this idolatry. Idolatry is this action of replacing what God created for us to live in, this gap of me resting in God's presence, knowing who I am, allowing God to define me. When you step out of that, you're placing your trust in something else. It's an idol. And so Jeremiah is calling out this idolatry, this refusal to listen. And here's what he says about Israel's response in Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16, this is what the Lord says: stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. I love that. Look back. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. But you said, Israel, your response was, we will not walk in it. This was a direct call to return to God's ways and a promise of rest. The tragedy is their refusal. They flat out refuse it. We will not walk in it, they say. Just like many of us today, they replaced God's presence with their pursuit of personal progress. A lot of us do this. It's very easy to slip into this temptation to replace God's presence with this pursuit of personal progress. Jeremiah in chapter 2, Jeremiah says this about God's words to his people. God is saying, my people have committed two sins. Sin is missing the mark. It's missing the mark from what God intended for us to experience in creation. My people have committed these two sins. They've forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they've dug their own cisterns, these wells meant for holding water, and they're broken cisterns. They cannot hold water. Like Israel, we often chase productivity and status and self-sufficiency, and we neglect God's design for rest and presence. And so Israel turned to Baal, ignoring the vulnerable. Last week we talked about how they ignored the vulnerable. They didn't care for widows and orphans and the people in their community that were most vulnerable. They didn't care about justice for people. They did not live with God's compassion. They rejected God's ways. And sometimes, as a church, sometimes if we're not careful, we're not so different. When we say, I don't have time for rest, the very thing that grounds me and reminds me of who I am in Jesus, when we say, I don't have time for that, what are we really worshiping? In other words, I want to put this question up here. Who or what do you rely on when you say, I don't have time for rest? Because when we don't have time for rest, we are relying on someone or something. I want to be real vulnerable with you all. This is my answer to that question. This is my very beautiful planner that I love. And my husband knows I live and die by this. He also is frustrated by that because he wants me to use this because this is what he's on for the calendar. I'm like 20 years behind, and I'm having a hard time catching up to doing my planning on this. This, if I'm not careful, can be my idol that I replace with God's rest, because very quickly my calendar can look like this. It can look like ending church right now and going and picking up my kids down at San Clemente where they have to spend the night. Great thing to do with my parents. Going and having dinner with friends later, having a work meeting in the morning, jumping from that to going to my community garden where I told somebody I'd help them with seed planting. After that, my husband goes to a community group. Then we have every single night after that full with other community groups and Bible studies. Those are good things. They're good things. After that, in the evening, we have a meetup with some other people we haven't seen in a while. Saturday's completely full with birthday parties and other events that we're going to. Oh, and then it's back to Sunday. Not to mention when fall starts up, AYSO, soccer, basketball. My daughter's gonna be back in swim. You see what I'm talking about here? all of us have something like this, most of us do, or something like this that can very quickly rule our lives, where we squeeze out any sort of space to actually just be. And a lot of the things we're doing are good. Like, they're good things. We should be doing a lot of these things. But pretty soon, we squeeze out any space to actually simply just be, to rest in God's presence, to be with family, to be at home, to be in a space where we can simply be and not be consumed with constantly doing and producing. My agenda can get so busy, so loud, that it pushes God's voice right out, because I don't actually give time to simply resting, to simply being in God's presence, saying yes to God's invitation to simply sit with God and let God remind me who I am and how much God loves me simply for who I am. And I can do that with family, and I can do that at home, I can do that alone, but just simply being. All right, so we've talked a lot about this idea of rest. I want you to go with me for a second. We're gonna make kind of what seems to be a very whoa, this is a 180. We're gonna jump to the topic of lament. And the reason why we're gonna do that, kind of in this harsh 180, is because Jeremiah talks a lot about this idea of lament or grief. I'm gonna go ahead and define and look more about what lament actually is. But the reason Jeremiah spends so much time on lament is because Jeremiah is grieving that Israel didn't listen to this command, this invitation from God to rest. So rest is very much connected to the reason why Jeremiah is lamenting or grieving, because Israel refused this rest. Now they're in this place of exile, this kind of natural dominoes of consequences where they've been defeated by the Babylonian Empire. And Jeremiah is going to lament the sin of idolatry, not to rest, the sin of idolatry to replace Baal with God's presence. Jeremiah is going to grieve that. Jeremiah doesn't suppress his grief over this. Jeremiah doesn't suppress his grief over this sin and their downfall. He voices his grief in very raw and painful ways. And so lament is this major theme in Jeremiah. Jeremiah is also known as a weeping prophet. Lament means to weep, to cry out, to wail, to mourn, to groan. I like how Rich Viotis, one of pastors that I like to listen to, he puts it this way, that lament is the prayer language for those who know disappointment, suffering, and unresolved pain. It's how we bring our grief and confusion honestly before God without having to fix or sanitize it first. Jeremiah laments the suffering of Israel's defeat and exile, but he also laments the sin that led the people to this destruction. Jeremiah's lament is as unsanitized as it gets. Here's one of the examples in Jeremiah chapter 4. He says, "Your conduct and actions have brought this on you. This is your punishment. How bitter it is, how it pierces to the heart. Oh, my anguish, my anguish." We read from the New International Version. If you read the King James Version, it actually says, "My bowels, my bowels. I writhe in pain. Oh, the agony of my heart. My heart pounds within me. I cannot keep silent." Most of our modern translations say, my anguish, and I really do think that captures it. But I actually think, even as silly as it is, we're missing something with my bowels, my bowels. In ancient Hebrew, they literally, in ancient Hebrew, they thought it's this gut-wrenching emotion that comes from the intestines. It's felt in the bowels, this type of lament, this type of grief. Think, I feel it, not I feel it in my heart, I feel it in my intestines. That's what's being said here. The Greeks, later on, they were more refined, or so they thought. They attributed emotions like this to the heart. The bowels, not so much. That would be considered gross. So what's the takeaway? When Jeremiah says, my bowels, he's not being weird or goofy. He's saying, I'm so devastated. I'm cut to the core. I feel it in the pit of my stomach. Some of us know that feeling. Like a punch that won't go away. Jeremiah laments because of Israel's idolatry, their refusal to rest, Israel's refusal to act justly, their refusal to let God's love take root in their lives. He's lamenting because of their refusal to listen. Jeremiah prophesies for decades. We talked about that last week. But he's ignored year after year after year. And more than being ignored, he's actually ridiculed and persecuted. He laments because of the pain that he experiences as Judah, Israel, lashes out against him and say, stop prophesying. Your words are hurting us. They throw him in this cistern, in this pit, and they leave him to die. He's lamenting. But through all of that, he lives. And as he lives, he keeps speaking God's truth. And he keeps lamenting. The outcome, Jerusalem still falls. Israel still doesn't listen. There's no rescue or revival. This is honestly a very tragic book. But Jeremiah, throughout all of it, remains faithful. Through all of it, Jeremiah is obedient to God's call on his life as a prophet, as a messenger of God, to speak truth about Israel's sin, which I'm sure was a very hard thing for him to do. He did not have a nice, flowery message for the people of Israel. And to lament their reality. Jeremiah's faithful obedience, it teaches us two things. I want to put this up here. His faithful obedience it teaches us that obedience doesn't earn us a comfortable life. It certainly wasn't for Jeremiah, and it certainly wasn't for Israel. And Jeremiah's faithful obedience teaches us that obedience is simply faithfulness to God's voice, regardless of the outcome. That's really hard for me, and I know that's really hard for a lot of us here. Jeremiah's hope isn't in a happy ending, but it's in God's unchanging character. That's Jeremiah's hope. Lament is what happens when you believe in a God that is still good, that is unchanging, that's with us, that's present, that God is a God of justice. And lament happens when you live in a world where that seems to somehow contradict that. Even when the people are exiled and the city is burned, Jeremiah trusts that God will act in God's time, not Jeremiah's. Here's an example of what Jeremiah's hope in God's promise looked like. This is Jeremiah's words from the Lord in Jeremiah chapter 29. This is what the Lord says, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. I will bring you back from captivity. These words are spoken to exiles in Babylon. These words are nestled in a passage of scripture where Jeremiah is actually calling on the people of God to settle in to this time of exile, that they're not going to escape it. He says things like plant gardens, marry, have kids, rebuild your lives in this period of uncomfortability and transition and exile and suffering. You're not going to escape it. It's this call to settle in while trusting that there will be future restoration. But it might not be and won't be in most of the lives of these Israelites living in this exile period. This isn't a feel-good promise for quick rescue. It's hope with a long view. Jeremiah says, don't escape the reality, but trust eventually in the promise of God's redemption. The real kicker is Jeremiah knows that he'll never see this promise come to fruition. It won't be fulfilled in his lifetime. He will die before this promise comes about. They're settling into this exile for 70 years. Jeremiah's life, it models this long-term obedience in the ruins, grieving with the exiled, lamenting the things that brought them to that point, and now the suffering they're experiencing, but also trusting in God's future redemption. We're called to the same faithfulness, even when there's no visible signs of rescue. I want to introduce you to a family that I have a picture of that I'm going to put up here. This is me in the center, and then my dear friend and coworker Bonnie, who probably most of you know. This is a picture that was taken in a tent of a refugee camp that is called the Barika camp in northern Iraq in a semi-autonomous region called Kurdistan. And we got to do several family visits while we were on this outreach trip with one of our partners from our church. That's a big part of what I get to do here on staff, is help dream up and mobilize ways that our church community can partner alongside the work that God is doing around the world. This is some amazing work through a nonprofit that is equipping and helping bring livelihood skills training and healing and therapy and medical aid to people who've seen really extreme suffering. Most of these folks that we visited, and this family in particular, a lot of the folks we visited are from Syria. They are Christians and Muslims that have come from Syria. In this camp in particular, this family was from an area in southern Iraq where they had fled ISIS. They had seen so much devastation in their community. They'd fled up into northern Iraq and Kurdistan. We got to sit with this family just 1 month previous to me this exact moment of this picture. This woman, who we've blurred their faces for just care and concern for them and safety, this woman who's in the black on the far right, she had lost her husband. These are all her kids in this picture, and there's actually kids behind the view of the person taking the picture that are also hers, and she's 7 months pregnant. I got to sit in this moment of watching her live out very practically and express lament. This is a modern day story of exile, similarities of what Israel experienced. And not for any sin or fault of this woman, she's found herself in this horrible suffering experience where her community in this camp have very little hope of immediate rescue. And actually, since this photo was taken, this camp closed down. The government closed this camp down, and they shuttled people back to their homelands that they came from, and she returned to nothing. There's a lot of buried landmines in their previous homes, so it's extremely dangerous. It hasn't been demined. Other people have moved in to their farmlands that they used to own. They don't own anything. They're not returning to a home that's still theirs. She returned to nothing, and she's lamenting, knowing that that's coming. And I cried. I sat with her and I cried. One, in solidarity, and because I was moved to the core, lamenting, grieving her position and what she's experiencing in life. I prayed with her, and I got to communicate this hope of God's redemption, that we can hold on to hope, but it's not a hope that always rescues us. And this is a very, very practical example of that. This woman's obedience, her faith, she was a follower of Jesus, her faith in Jesus is this model of faithful obedience that Jeremiah shows us. That we might not be rescued from suffering and hardship. That we might go through inexplainable, atrocious things in life. But God walks with us through those things. And we have this opportunity to lean into a God who's with us, present, gently caring for us, no matter what we experience in life. 2 messages from Jeremiah. Lamenting the injustice, the sin, and the pain of this world. And this woman faithfully leaning into God's voice, obeying God's leading, trusting in God's guidance, even when we're not rescued from pain. And so I want to put 2 closing questions here for us to ponder. What do you need to grieve, and what do you need to trust? Put another way for that first question. What pain or brokenness or sin might you need to lament in your life? And the second question, what does faithful obedience look like from you amidst that pain? How is God calling you to rest or to take a step in ways that can invite God's presence into our lives amidst that pain, knowing that God is with us, that we might not be rescued from it, and that God is still a God of love and trust and care and gentleness with us through every moment of our lives. Most of us don't have these similar experiences to the family that I shared from this refugee camp. Most of us aren't going to ever experience that type of hardship. But we all have some type of pain. We all have some type of suffering. And we all have some type of sin and idolatry that we need to lament or grieve. A few months ago, about a month ago, I walked into my house, and I had just kind of walked in with this weight of like the last year. Now, I have a really, I'm not going to dramatize it. I know I have a very comfortable, stable, great life. But we've had a lot of family transition. We moved unexpectedly. My husband started a new job, which has been great, but nonetheless, change and transition last January. My kids are aging out of preschool. As a mom, I was kind of just like, oh, they're going to kindergarten. I'll never have that like kind of preschool age. And I'd had a hard work meeting, and I felt yucky. I walked into my house, and I had been so busy. This had ruled my life in that season. This was an idol of like, well, if I can just control everything that's happening and I can schedule rest in there, then I'll be fine. I can make it happen. I can hold it all together. I have to be strong. I walked into my house, and it was our first night spending the first night in our new place. My husband had 2 pints of ice cream, and he said, "Isn't this great? We can like celebrate with ice cream and just like watch a movie and hang out, and we're in our new spot. What an amazing season." And I broke down sobbing as he's holding this ice cream here, waiting and I'm sobbing. And I just love that my husband did this. He sensed that I needed this. He just didn't say anything. He turned around, he with the ice cream, he put it back in the freezer, and he said, "You can go to bed." And that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted to go to bed. I wanted to lament, to grieve. But the form it took first is I wanted a pity party, honestly. I cried. I wanted a pity party. I cried myself to sleep. And the next morning I was thinking about it, what I really needed to lament, what I really needed to feel emotions for and to face, to name, was my refusal to trust that God could provide rest in a season that very seemingly did not lend itself to rest. I needed to lament my control, my power grab to control it all. I needed to lament that idol in my life. all of us have things that we need to grieve, that we need to name, to lament, whether it's sin, idolatry, whether it's suffering, whether it's pain, not caused by sin. Just, we live in a broken, hard world. All of us have something we need to grieve, to lament. And all of us have an opportunity to take a step to trust God amidst that pain. And that looks different for all of us. God is doing something different in each of our lives. But that opportunity is there. What do you need to trust? God, we thank you so much just for Jeremiah. We thank you for this series, the prophets. God, I thank you for what you are teaching me, what you are moving and doing in my life, teaching me rest. God, I thank you for the people in this church that even in this season are encouraging me in that. God, I just pray that over this community in Huntington Beach, this church, that we would learn your rest, that we would say yes to postures and rhythms in life that allow us to just simply sit with you and not replace you with other idols in our lives, whether it is busyness or control or other things. God, I pray that you would teach us what it means to trust you. I pray all these things in your name, Jesus.